Well, more plastics are now banned in Queensland, South Australia and Western Australia in an attempt to protect our marine life. Joining us live is Shane Cucow, Plastics Manager at the Australian Marine Conservation Society. Shane, really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much. I think a lot of us are becoming a lot more aware about our use of plastics, but just highlight for us some of the plastics that might be used in everyday life that we might not be aware are actually having a terrible impact on our oceans.
Well, actually, I think it feels like these days almost every wrap, pack and snack is covered in plastic. We constantly have people reaching out to us frustrated because they're seeing, fresh fruit and veggie produce at supermarkets wrapped in plastic that's more expensive than loose produce, or seeing everyday items covered in plastic when they just don't need to be. We're certainly seeing that the types of plastic that are turning up in ocean cleanups are things like soft plastics, food and beverage packaging, and those kinds of takeaway plastics that are used on a regular basis, like cups or takeaway containers, or things like cotton bud sticks that are being phased out in many of these states.
Well, yeah, and that's a good point because those cotton bud sticks and also microbeads, as I understand it, are being banned in some states but not others. It seems like we have a really disparate sort of setup in terms of the laws around these issues right across the country.
Yes, it's certainly becoming an interesting conundrum. We've benefited, I think, from a bit of a race to the top between the states and territories, competing against each other to see who can tackle more of the plastics that need to be phased out. But now we have this piecemeal environment where it's actually becoming quite difficult for many businesses. So certainly we're encouraging the state, territory and federal environment ministers to work together on a roadmap to harmonise our bans on single-use plastics across the country that's ambitious and deals with the plastics that are turning up in our oceans.
Okay, and talk to us about balloons. We all might remember days of the past going to birthday parties packed full of balloons, but these days, and I tell you what, my kids come home and tell me they don't want me to put up balloons for parties anymore, and the message seems to be getting out that they are causing a huge amount of destruction.
It really is the case. So balloons are one of the more lethal plastics for wildlife, particularly for seabirds. We know that they're the most lethal type of plastic. It's already killed off the... And the big reason for that is that they fly away really easily, end up in our oceans hundreds of kilometres from where they're released. And then they pose both an entanglement threat if a bird gets caught in, say, the ribbon, but also an ingestion threat. So if they're eaten, they wrap around other items in their stomach and cause life-threatening blockages. And what we know, unfortunately, is despite claims by the balloon industry, tests by Australian researchers have showed that they're actually not, they don't break down quickly in the environment, and we know that they're not recyclable. So we're pleased to see Queensland joining WA and Victoria in actually banning the practice of releasing balloons. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that in New South Wales and the ACT where it's explicitly allowed still.
And Shane, as awful as it is for the marine life to deal with these plastics in the ocean, it's also worth making the point, isn't it, that it's coming back into humans as well in terms of microplastics then being eaten essentially by us as we eat some of those animals from the ocean.
It really is concerning. We're certainly seeing there's been research that shows that the average human is eating about a credit card's worth of plastic on a regular basis, just from those tiny little nanoplastics that are turning up in everything. And it's not just from the fish we eat, but also sort of nanoplastic shedding off of plastic Tupperware and containers and bottles. There's a variety of ways in which these nanoplastics are ending up in our systems. And the truth is we don't yet know what the impact of that is on our systems. And it's something that we should be concerned about.
And what can we do in terms of the costs here? Because as we know, when we go to the shops, we're faced with some eco-friendly versions of cling wrap, for example, but they're often a lot more expensive than the traditional brands. How do you suggest we go about that in terms of making it more cost-effective to be more environmentally friendly when it comes to our plastic use?
Well, unfortunately, one of the real challenges is that producers of plastic haven't really been held accountable for the costs of dealing with that plastic at end of life. And at the moment, it's taxpayers who are bearing the burden of paying for all that recycling and waste infrastructure that we dramatically need to increase to be able to deal with the huge tides of plastic that are being produced. So part of that is we've been letting them get away with not paying for that for too long, so that fresh, virgin, fossil fuel-based plastic is cheaper than a recycled plastic or a plant-based plastic. So we need our governments to step in and regulate in that regard to help with that. But also, we really need to be looking at how we can avoid plastic altogether. So today, we've seen a lot of producers aren't giving consumers the choice, aren't actually doing things like finding ways of doing these in reusable containers, refillable containers, so that people don't have to pay for the cost of packaging in the first place. Or looking at ways that we can move to things that, like cardboard or paper, where they do break down quickly if they end up in the environment.
Shane, really appreciate you making the time to speak with us about that. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.